This is a rather misty Sunday morning, so I'm going to be looking for somewhere to paint, but could have some quite interesting effects. And one of the things I have to watch out for is the conditions changing, maybe as the sun gets through the mist.
I headed to the Curly, a local pond in the area of the links, golf courses between the town and the beach. The wildlife that I see at the pond usually includes swans, mallard ducks, herring gulls, black-headed gulls, moorhen, coot, a heron, crows. I have seen a water rail and, depending on the season, swallows and froglets.
One of the concerns I had was it being a Sunday morning and with a good forecast was whether the park would be full of dog walkers and children and stuff. But the mist and the fact that it's February means it's still fairly quiet. Just need to build up my confidence about filming in public and doing my artwork in public. So we'll see how I get on. The mist is quite interesting. It's really atmospheric, but obviously it might burn off later. So I need to decide what I'm going to paint and get on and do it quickly before the conditions change. See you later. I've done a couple of quick thumbnail sketches. You can see they're not terribly detailed or informative. As you can see, the mist has sort of burned off quite a bit, so I'll be trying to remember how the mist affected everything. I'm maybe looking back at some of the video I took earlier.
I start off by blocking in the main shapes of the reed beds. Then I block in the grey of the sky. I want to make it dark enough to provide contrast, to make the really diffuse sunlight glow. And I put in a base layer of pastel for the water too. I blend the initial layers with a piece of piping solution. At this point, I'm trying to cover the paper by building up on those initial layers. I start to give a little definition to the distant trees. Not too much because of the mist, but just enough to give the impression of the trees in the distance. Next I start on the reeds in the midground. I was playing a bit at this point, pulling and pushing the level of contrast and detail, trying to pull in some darker areas then into the mist by blending it out again. This stage was tricky because the scene in front of me was much more detailed and lit, and I was trying to remember the effect of the mist. So working out what level of detail, contrast and saturation I wanted. It was definitely trial and error. Mist reduces contrast, obscures detail and desaturates colour, making it greyer. At this point, I added a little more colour into the leaves. Although it might have made it look a little less misty, I did want to try it out whilst knowing that I could always grey down the colours again later if it went too far. In the end, although it wasn't accurate to the earliest conditions, I did like the effect. I added details to the reeds like the feathery tops and reflections in the water, and then I worked on the edges of the reeds where they met the water, using shadow and then highlights glistening off the ripples in the water to help define the edge and to make the water look wet. I love wildlife, and of course it belongs in the painting of the pond. When I first arrived, the swans were on the edge of the reeds, and I thought it would be nice to place them there in my picture. I'd also been taken with the tufted ducks, which I hadn't seen before, so I definitely wanted them in too. I very roughly placed the birds. They didn't look great, but I find it easier to work on the fine details at home, where I can take my time. I created more highlights on the surface of the water.
Now that I've packed everything away, the mist, which had disappeared in the middle of me painting, has returned, which might have been helpful when I was wondering how did this look when it was misty again. But that's the challenge of painting outdoors, is the conditions change. You just have to adapt, and I could always go back and look at the footage that I have from earlier and work on the painting at home. So that's an option.
At home, I redrew the swans and the tufted ducks more accurately, though the swans are still not very detailed because of the distance and the mist. I also made some changes to the background after looking at the photos I'd taken to add a bit of interest. Simple things like showing the light reflecting off the distant grasses, which helps separate it from the pond, and adding reflections in the water. I probably would have saved myself a lot of guesswork later on if I hadn't still tried to capture the scene as I'd first seen it, but I loved its eerie lights. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to see more in this plein air series. I'll see you next week. Until then, go outdoors, be inspired, and create.